Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about LECA versus Aroid mix. If you've been in the houseplant world for a bit, you've definitely heard of chunky Aroid mix, and you've likely heard of LECA. This plant is LECA with a little bit of perlite mixed in. You guys have heard me talk about it. And this plant is our 3-2-1 Aroid mix, 3 parts coconut chips, 2 parts perlite, and 1 part coconut coir, which can be substituted for some peat. Also, you want to add in a little bit of slow release fertilizer into this guy. But for your LECA, you're going to be fertilizing every time with an AB LECA fertilizer or something inorganic that you have at home. So today we're going to go over the pros and cons of each and kind of where I see fit using Aroid mix and where I prefer LECA perlite. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video. I'm going to tell you why I prefer LECA the most, and it's really an unknown reason. Alright, so LECA up first. Overall, LECA is a lot cleaner than dirt or Aroid mix. When you lift up the pot, you're not going to see a lot of the dirt residue that's under the pot. Also, after you water, you're not going to have a bunch of runoff to where you're actually losing growing media each time. Another huge benefit of LECA is that it has substantially less pests. So because it's not sitting wet, it's not attracting all of those fungus gnats and other flies and even spider mites and thrips and things that can live in the top layer of the soil or Aroid mix because it's mostly just rocks. LECA is typically easier to transplant and it's really easy to check out the roots. You can kind of scrape back, but it can be difficult to tell when it's needed to be watered, whereas soil or Aroid mix, you kind of stick your finger in and feel it. Because it's not holding all that water in here like the Aroid mix, it's going to have a significantly less chance and less probability of getting root rot. And also, if you ever get that root rot, it's really easy to pull the plant out and then hose it down. I just take like a garden hose, high pressure, and I'll spray off the roots to where the sharp stream almost cuts off the dead roots. A big downside of LECA is that price per volume, LECA is pretty expensive and it's not available everywhere. So that is kind of a downside. You typically have to buy it online or go to a hydroponic store to buy. But a huge benefit and why I've loved it for years is that it is reusable. So after I take out this plant and transplant it, which I don't have to do that often as Aroid mix because there's so many more areas for the roots to grow, I can sterilize that LECA media in either bleach or hydrogen peroxide and or boiling water and then reuse that media on this next transplant or even an additional plant. So I'm almost always consistently using the same quantity of LECA and it's not kind of running down the drain, which many times you'll see your soil just run right down the drain. And a big downside of LECA obviously is that every time I'm watering this plant, I'm mixing up a gallon of water and I'm watering over it. And you typically want to water on a pretty close window of about 7 to 10 days for something this big. And if you miss that watering window, it can be less forgiving than something like Aroid mix. And as I said, that schedule is pretty strict, so you want to hit your watering windows pretty smack on, but it's really easy to tell if you have root rot or any root issues. You can unpot the plant quite easily and repot it without really damaging anything too much. And the biggest benefit of LECA by far is the rate at which it grows. And this pertains to non-passive LECA. So it pertains to the type of LECA that doesn't sit in water. This has drainage and it is a mixture of LECA and perlite at 50-50. I water it about once per week. But because it's sitting in just those rocks, it's going to grow really, really fast. The more air you have in your root zone, the more roots you're going to create and you're going to avoid that root rot. And the plant is just going to grow much, much faster. Typically about 30% faster. I do prefer LECA for thicker rooted plants. Typically Monstera I almost exclusively put into LECA. The Epipremnoids, aka the Esqueleto, does really good in LECA. Obviously the Deliciosa does well. The Lecheriana I believe does well. We're having good luck with the Burl Marx Flame in LECA. So many Monsteras with that thick cord like root does really good in LECA. But if you have thinner root plants, Syngonium sometimes, and or a lot of the philodendrons, you're gonna want to probably use Aroid mix. And to be honest, I use a mixture of these two in my shop. So on to the Aroid mix. As I said, this one is 3-2-1 Aroid mix. That coconut core that's fine is gonna hold your water. Those chunks of perlite is gonna give it a lot of drainage. And again, that perlite is gonna give it a lot of drainage. And then that slow release fert is gonna feed your plant over time and you're gonna reapply those little granules about every 6 months. Or you can just consistently water with a liquid fertilizer fertilizer during the growing season. So as we said about Aroid mix, it's just typically a lot dirtier. You're going to spill dirt more, it's going to come out of the drainage hole onto your table, it's going to actually subside, like this soil will actually sink over time and shrink because the plant is actually consuming it and the nutrients out of it, as well as you're losing physical soil out of the bottom of your pot. And as we said, of course, pests are gonna love this more. I don't have to talk to you about fungus gnats. You know how these fungus gnats come after our soil. They still love that wet media that stays wet on top for longer. They come in, they nest in it. But this is much less maintenance. Each time I'm just grabbing a cup of water and pouring it over it. It's already got the fertilizer in it, so I don't have to think about it. And if I miss the watering window by a few days, it's far more forgiving than LECA. It's not a big deal to kind of underwater. It self-corrects much easier, and it's kind of a much easier learning curve. And for things like this epiprenum and or these philodendrons with a little bit of a thinner root system, they really do love Aroid mix, although this does really well in the LECA also, and obviously this is a philodendron in LECA. You just kind of have to be careful with what you're planting, but I do use both of these media in my shop. I'm not going to talk about soil because if you're using a typical soil blend, it should be for outdoors. If you're doing things indoors, I really suggest going away from soil. Anything that is just dirt, you need to get away from because you're creating a lot of root problems likely, and there's not enough air in your soil. And with the Aroid mix, you're gonna have to transplant more. So this is going to fill up with roots, and then that's going to become like a big root ball that you're gonna have to break open and put into the next size up pot. But this is a much more affordable volume of media. This coconut husk is quite cheap, perlite is relatively cheap, as well as coconut coir or peat. I suggest not using peat, but coconut coir is best, a little more expensive, a little less accessible. Because this stays more moist and your watering window is stretched out, it's going to grow slower, and there will be slightly increased chance of root rot because it's holding so much more moisture. Now, Aroid mix is semi-reusable. When you unpot it, there will be a bunch of chunks that you can just repot back in. We all do that, that's totally fine. Another big problem I have with Aroid mix is for little plants when they're really small. Because of the life in the Aroid mix or the soil, I get much higher rates of damping off, being a small seedling kind of dying back because it stays moist around the stem. So I'll get a lot of stem rot, or for any of my tissue culture plants, if I go directly into Aroid mix, it can sometimes become a problem by introducing this biology, which there's a lot more life in this Aroid mix than there is in this LECA. And generally, I would say Aroid mix is a little bit tougher to store and just messy, whereas LECA is pretty compact and kind of stays where it is. Although if you do spill LECA, you're in for a really annoying cleanup. Same goes for straight up. So to summarize, I would say LECA has tons of benefits by growing faster, but it is a little less forgiving than an Aroid mix. The Aroid mix does grow a little slower, but it is more user friendly, but this will have a higher chance of root rotting than your LECA. If you get root rot with LECA, it's really easy to spray out those roots. So if you're doing something like Thai Constellation or something that has high rates of root rot, consider doing LECA, but I do use both of these in our greenhouse here at Pretty and Great. So thanks you guys so much for watching this week's video. If you did enjoy it, please consider subscribing and or liking the video. It does help us out so much. Thanks for watching again, and we'll see you next Saturday for another video about houseplants. Have a good day.